Let's find book of Ruth and chapter number 1. You should have your notes still from prior. I think it was Mac. Were you asking me earlier? Are we still in chapter 1? Somebody was asking me that. So, all right. Let's find Ruth chapter number 1 and read some of it, and then we'll get into just a very brief synopsis, and then we'll pick up where we left off. All right, it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came into the country of Moab and continued there. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. And they took them wives of the women of Moab, and the name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. And Mahlon and Chilion died, also both of them, and the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. So we talked about the fact that they had a crisis at home with the famine in the land, and they ended up running to what was enemy territory in Moab. And it says that they went to sojourn, but he ended up staying there. And of course, we looked at the cost that was to the family by that decision. We looked at the introduction to the family. Elimelech is my God is king, but if you recall, I said that he sure wasn't living like it at that point. And as a husband and a father, he made a decision that affected his family. And Naomi went from being pleasant, which is what her name means, to being something different, which we'll look at here later on today. The 2 sons, if you recall, were Mahlon and Chilion. Mahlon means sick. It's the name of his name. And then Chilion means pining or like wasting away. So you just picture somebody who's starving to death, and they're wasting away. And that's what his name meant. They get into this foreign land. Of course, then they're in some distress there because Elimelech dies now very soon after they arrive in Moab. And with his death now, the story really begins to get some depth. And we see the depth of hurt before we see the depth of God's grace coming into Naomi's life. But we have these wearied lives now that are touched by tragedy, and God is setting the stage for a story. And what we find from the very beginning of the story is now that they're in the land of Moab, what you have is you have a picture here, which is the whole book of Ruth is painting a picture of Israel as a nation. It's a picture of Israel in unbelief, away from the land. They're wasting away. They are sickly. They're apart from their relationship with God. They're in unbelief, so God is not their king. And of course, that's borne out through the entire Old Testament, isn't it? That's the journey of Israel, where they have rejected the headship of God and gone after the idols of the world and the nations around them. And they were a sickly nation right up until the time that they were delivered into captivity in 606. And so that's what you have being played out in this story. In chapter 1 and verse number 4, we, of course, see the intermarriage of the sons. And we talked about this and the fact that they married these 2 daughters, and then they lived about 10 years in the land at the time. And then after that 10-year mark, roughly, then both of the sons died. So whatever happened with the boys in this family, there was a problem, because everybody died reasonably early, all right, the death of the sons. So you might pick that up in your notes. I believe that's where we are now, the death of the sons. We're in Ruth chapter 1 and verse number 5. Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them, and the woman was left of her 2 sons. And so we see, of course, how different the story, the turn of the story takes now. They've intermarried amongst the heathen, these 2 boys. And then they died themselves not long after that. And I don't know that any of us could really comprehend that kind of suffering. So here, from Naomi's perspective, she's lost her husband. She's in a foreign land. And now both of her sons have died. And so any connection she had to stability in her life, that connection is now gone. Because as a woman, she had no capacity to really care for herself, much less her daughters-in-law. And so she's really left in quite a difficult situation. And so they built their homes in Moab, and what happened? Moab became their grave. And that's the story that we're at. So we've got 3 graves, no means of survival, and Naomi now stands alone in a foreign land. So looking at your notes now, we're going to start with the next section here, and this is a hopeless return. A hopeless return. This is number 3 in your notes. Really a hopeless situation that she finds herself in. Now, if you recall, we talked about a little bit about the fact that Naomi's character had begun to shine, and our story is going to bear this out. But even after the death of her husband, her character was shining still. Bitterness had not yet fully set in at that time. But I want you to notice a few things about her. So if you look at verse number 6, Ruth chapter 1 and verse number 6, she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab how that the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. So somehow or another, word got down to Moab that that there's food back in Bethlehem. So the famine's over, there's a harvest that's back, and so she makes up her mind it's time to go. So letter A in your notes, the heart of a widow. The heart of the widow. We've really got some fresh insight here into Naomi and Naomi's relationship with God. So let's just explore that, because there's a lot of practical learning here for all of us, for the ladies here, but for all of us as well. Just some insight into Naomi. We see that she was widowed and childless, and she's now in exile. All right, so if you recall the map that we had, it's in your notes there, I think, but that map shows that there is was that the introduction? I think it was our introductory lesson. But the map shows where Israel is. There you can see it there, and you go up and around and down, and you get to Moab. And so there's quite a journey of her being able to get back to where Bethlehem was. And so she's in exile in this land here, and far away from where home was, where any semblance of family help might be, and she finds herself in exile. But what Naomi never did was she never adopted the ways of Moab. Even what you see her saying in her bitterness later on, she had never adopted the ways or the beliefs or the gods of Moab. She had stayed faithful in her exile. So even though bitterness crept in because of her life circumstances, she never adopted those ways. She was true to her convictions as a woman, and she lived those convictions out in the sight of her daughters-in-law. And that's why you have such a profound impact in Ruth's life, because in her exile and in her grief, even though bitterness was rising up in her because of her situation, she still displayed a godliness toward her daughters-in-law that was visible to those girls. And it made a huge impact in their life. And so she never adopted the ways of Moab. She lived out her convictions, and Orpah and Ruth both saw that. And obviously, her character was so strong that it really convincingly touched the hearts of those two young women. Her daughters-in-law, they were actually both willing to relocate with Naomi and settle back in Israel. So if you just picture this whole thing in reverse, Naomi is in a strange country, a foreign land, not necessarily accepted by the Moabites, and now she's going to go back home, and her daughters-in-law are going to do the same thing in reverse. They're willing to go to Israel, where they know that they're not accepted. They know that they're considered to be the enemy and unclean. They're not going to be embraced with open arms, and yet the testimony of their mother-in-law was so great in their life that they were willing to risk everything themselves and go to Israel with her. So it just tells you a lot about her character. And there's a lot you can think about in times of adversity and following the character of Naomi there. But not only that, but we have the faith of Naomi that's on display here. It was genuine. And what it did was it compelled at least Ruth to forsake her idolatry. Ruth, as a Moabitess, would have been an idolater just like Orpah was. But the spiritual character of Naomi was such that it compelled Ruth to seek after and eventually follow the God of Israel. And so what did she do? She forsook her own idolatry. Well, to me, that's a powerful indication of Naomi's faith and how that transferred into her daughter-in-law. And it's just a great example to all of us. You might be in a family situation where you have somebody that you love that is lost, and you never know the faith that you have, how that can bleed over into the life of somebody that you love. It reminds me in 1 Corinthians, I think, chapter 7, about the unbelieving wife and the husband, or the unbelieving husband and the wife. And Paul said, who knows whether you can save your husband or save your wife by your testimony? If they don't want to leave you, then let them stay, because your testimony might see them get saved. And it's an encouragement. And we see that borne out here in this way in Naomi's life. And so what we see here is it was Naomi's acquaintance with sorrow and poverty that really provided her the opportunities to declare the grace of God. You know, the grace of God at work in our life is seen in times of hurt and need. That's when grace is needed. Now, we don't understand and receive God's grace when everything is going great. We don't recognize it, or we certainly don't display it. But in times of hurt and sorrow and pain, that's when you see the grace of God at work in your life, and that's when it's most visible to other people. And so as Naomi is going through this time of hurt and suffering, obviously God's grace is at work, and the daughters-in-law are both looking at that now, and she has the opportunity to declare that. And there's a great moral lesson in that for all of us as we think about the story, because we often seek the comfort and pleasures of life. None of us are inclined to volunteer for hurt. So we seek after the comfort and the pleasure, but those places in life often remove us from the people that need to be reached with the love of God. And sometimes God puts us in times of hurt and sorrow so that his grace can be seen through our lives to impact others. So it's a good perspective to have when you face times of hurt, or when somebody in your family faces a time of hurt, and you recognize that you're stewarding that trial and that hurt, but God may have given that to you for somebody else's benefit. And such was the case with Naomi. God gave this to Naomi, but it benefited Ruth in quite a significant way. So it's just a great story when you think about the principles there into Naomi's life. So that's the heart of the widow. But let's look at the road home. Now she's going to be on her way home. And so her ties to Moab are now severed. Her husband's no longer there. The boys are no longer there. She has no stability, no security. And so the ties to that country are gone. Nothing holds her to Moab anymore. So she takes Orpah, she takes Ruth, and she begins to travel the northward road home. And if you pick it up in verse number 7, she'd heard that God had visited her people. So it says, wherefore she went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return unto the land of Judah. Now, here's a difficult discussion in your notes, a difficult discussion that she has to have. They start the journey back to Moab. This is going to be a first for the girls, and this is going to be the first in 10 plus years for Naomi. She's on her way back. But they've no sooner left and are on the journey than she has to have a conversation with the girls. And along the way, she realizes she's got to speak plainly to them about what's happening in life, okay? So this isn't just an adventure. Girls, we need to have a conversation. So it's a difficult conversation she has to have because she's living in poverty, but she's returning to poverty. It's not like there's a fortune waiting for her back in the old country. She's leaving poverty as a widow, and she's going back to the home of her nativity, but she's in poverty there. So she's got to have that conversation. Girls, there's nothing for you here. And obviously she realizes that the lives of her daughters-in-law are going to be very difficult if they do go with her to Israel. You know, why are they going to be difficult? Because, as I said before, the way that the Moabites were treated by the Jews, by the way, by the command of God, they were enemies of Israel, right? And so there was meant to be a distinction. So if they were to go back into Israel and try to settle in there, they would have a very difficult time just trying to survive. And she wants to tell them what's happening here. She would expect the Hebrews to scorn these Moabitish women. You're not going to be a part of us. You're not going to marry our sons. You're going to live in perpetual widowhood. There's nothing here for you. And she wants to have the conversation with the girls about this. And they'd be very unlikely to ever marry. And that's the big deal. So we're just going to make some presumptions here. We don't know how old Orpah and Ruth were, but they're not very old, okay? If they would have married at probably the average normal age back in those days, they would have married the boys probably still in their teens. So that, undoubtedly, they would have been in their mid-20s or something by this stage, maybe late 20s. Still very strong, very young, very eligible, if you will. But she's looking at the girls, and she's going to tell them here in our story, if you come back with me, there's nothing for you. There's nothing there for you. So let's read verses 8 to 13 as she has this conversation. Naomi said unto her 2 daughters-in-law, go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Now, what does that mean, to find rest? Well, in the context, and if you read the Old Testament, the rest she's talking about is the rest that a woman finds when she marries a husband. So she's saying, you need to find rest, and you're not going to find it with me. You're going to find it back home. So find rest in the house of her husband, whoever that man is going to be. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voice and wept. And they said unto her, surely we will return with thee unto thy people. And Naomi said, turn again, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there yet any more sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn again, my daughters, go your way, for I'm too old to have an husband. If I should say, I have hope, if I should have a husband also tonight, and should also bear sons, would you tarry for them till they were grown? Would you stay for them from having husbands? In other words, would you just hold off until this infant was now old enough? Nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sakes, that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me. So now we can see that some of the bitterness maybe that's starting to show forth. I realize that we can identify these things in Naomi's life, and I don't excuse her bitterness, but none of us have walked a mile in Naomi's shoes. And so for us to understand what's coming out of her heart, it doesn't excuse it, but it does explain it. It does explain why she's going to say what she says. She had a difficult discussion, but now I want you to notice there's a different decision. If you look in your notes there, a different decision. We're going to see a parting of the ways. The discussion with the girls is, there's nothing for you, and I have nothing for you. Go. But each of the girls has to make their own decision, and they made different decisions. So we start with Orpah. Now, notice what both girls are presented with here. They're presented with the reality of never marrying again. That's the conversation Naomi has. You will never marry. There's other things she would have said, but this is what she said. You'll never marry again, okay? And what happens with Orpah? Orpah caves in. The issue with both of these girls that Naomi's looking at is marriage, and Orpah can't handle that. Now, we already know in verse number 5 that verse number 15, that she's an idolater. Because she leaves Naomi to go back home. And look at verse 15. Naomi said to Ruth, behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back unto her people and unto her gods. Return thou after thy sister-in-law. So it's evident that there's a difference between Orpah and Ruth at this stage. Ruth has already accepted the truth of Jehovah God. Orpah's still an idolater, okay? So Orpah caves in. She's already an idolater. She's got no sincere interest in Naomi's God. She loves Naomi, but she doesn't love Naomi's God. But she's an example, I think, in the New Testament of one that Jesus talked about, thou art not far from the kingdom of God. She's an example of somebody that was almost there, but not there. Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian, right on the edge. I believe that there is a God, I just don't believe in this God, okay? And half committed to belief, but really still too much in love with the old life to get saved. But the pull of marriage here is what's so strong. This is the conversation she has. And the pull of marriage is what is strong for Orpah. So she realizes, if I go back with Naomi, it's not about religion, it's not about Jehovah God, whoever that is. It's about the fact that I will never have rest and I'll never have what I want. And so I want to get married, and that's what's most important to me. So that pull of marriage is strong. The desire to settle and the desire to have a family, it overrides everything else. And I'm telling you, when you think from the standpoint of principles of life, we see this story play out over and over and over again in modern Christianity. It's the same story. It's the pull of marriage, the desire for marriage that overrides biblical truth. And how many of our people, how many Christians fall into this very same trap? That's the biggest pull for them. And rather than being faithful to the Lord and prayerful and waiting on the Lord, in desperation, they make a choice, a decision. And the decision is what? To go find the bride or find the groom in the world. That's what happens in Christianity. Okay, that's what's played out in principle here in Orpah's life. It's such a massive danger. And, it's very clearly spoken of in the New Testament. Paul talked about what marriage is meant to look like. You don't yoke an unbeliever with a believer. And we know the heartache and the differences that come into a life when you start a life out that way willingly. It's a different story if two unbelievers get saved or get married and then one of them gets saved later. It's a different scenario. But when a saved person marries a lost person in direct violation of what God had said, there's a lot of heartache that's coming. And that's the problem that and no doubt for those of you that have been saved a while, you've seen that play out right here in this church and in other places in your Christian life. It still happens that way. Running to the world in desperation to find the life's partner. So with Orpah, the pull of marriage is what's so strong in Orpah's life. And if you notice in verse 14, they lifted up their voice and wept again. And notice it says that Orpah kissed her mother-in-law. What is that? Bye. It's a kiss of love and affection. I don't think she wanted to be separated from Naomi. Obviously, she was already willing to have started the journey to Israel with her. But when they got wherever they stopped, and Naomi said, girls, I got to tell you this. You're never going to marry. Then that pull was so strong that Orpah said, okay, I'm not going to do this. So it was a kiss of love and grief and affection and all of that wrapped up. But Orpah made the decision to go back to the home country, okay? But we look at Ruth, and this is a different decision altogether. She tells a different story. And obviously, we know, if you've read the book, it's a wonderful story. So Ruth is also presented with the same argument. What's the argument? There's nothing for you. You'll probably never marry. And that's just the way it's going to be. So she's presented with the exact same story and argument, but her desires as a woman were completely unselfish and in line with a heart of faith in God. Because that's borne out in what she says to Naomi here in just a minute. So she's presented with the same argument, the same problem that is facing her in her life, but her vision is on God. She already knew who God was. She was already a believer. So her vision was somewhere very different than Orpah's was. And I think this again just really shows the missionary character of Naomi, because even though she was in exile, she still bore witness to the one true God. And Ruth saw that, and Ruth believed in God because of the testimony of her mother-in-law. And so it was this that drew Ruth into the faith. This was her motive for following Naomi back to Israel. Her motive was God, back to Bethlehem. Notice what she said in verse number 15 again. Behold, thy sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return thou after thy sister-in-law. Now, I have a hard time accepting that statement. I struggle with that statement, right? You read that and say, how in the world could Naomi say that? It's one thing to say, go back to Moab. It's another thing entirely to say, go back to your old gods. You can see the shift in Naomi's heart. The bitterness is rising itself up, okay? But this is what she presented to Ruth. But the response of Ruth reveals her virtue, and if you'll write that in your notes. Ruth's response really reveals what her virtue is. And this is such a wonderful story for all of us, but particularly for women, a Christian woman who looks at this, because God's calling attention to something about the virtuous woman here, which obviously is a big flag for a woman, because there's so much in the Bible that refers to the way God looks at a virtuous woman. So if we look at verse number 16, chapter 1 of verses 16 and 17, Ruth said this, entreat me not to leave thee. Don't beg me to leave you, or to return from following after thee, for whither thou goest I will go, and where thou lodgest I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. And then notice, the Lord, that's Jehovah God, the Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part me and thee. Okay, now you see the virtue in that statement from Ruth. There's two things about that statement, if you notice in your notes. Number one, it was a statement of affection. A statement of affection. She was saying to her mother-in-law, I'll follow you. I'll live with you. I'll become a Hebrew. And I think that anybody that would have a daughter-in-law would crave that relationship with their daughter-in-law, that kind of affection. It was a deep love, okay? So it was a wonderful thing to see. So her virtue was a statement of affection toward Naomi, but it was also, secondly in your notes, it was a statement of conviction. It was a statement of conviction. When she says, entreat me not to leave, it was a statement of conviction, okay? I will serve and follow Jehovah God. Your God is my God. So it wasn't just, I'm going to adopt whatever because I want to be with you. This was a statement of conviction. And we know that to be true because later in the story, Boaz says to Ruth, The whole city knows that you're a virtuous woman. And it wasn't just that she had moral character, it was that she had godly character, and everybody knew it. So when she makes this statement, it was also a statement of conviction. I believe in God. So she went at some point, from idolatry to belief in God. And so notice what it says in verse number 18, and I can almost see the relief, the inner joy that Naomi would have had at this point, verse number 18. And when she saw that she was steadfastly minded to go with her, then she left speaking unto her. All right, conversation's over. Let's go down the road. So we're going to leave it there for tonight, and we're going to get into our prayer time. But when we come back together again next week, we're going to talk about now the bitterness of coming back into the home country, and how she was perceived and the things that were said and how she responded to all of that. And as I said, I think to you last Wednesday, this really is all just setting the stage for the best part of the story, which will come to us when we start getting into chapter number 2 and the life of Boaz. All right, why don't we leave it there tonight? Father, thank you for your word once again. And we learn a lot from this story. Thank you for the things that it teaches us even tonight. Help us, Lord, as we think through the week and think through who and what we are in our conviction, our character, our love for you, that if we face a time of real heartache and trial in our own life, that we would display the kind of godly character Naomi did, and we'd be a good testimony to people around us who watch us as we suffer. So thank you for the things we can learn from this tonight. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.